10 plus 3 Surprises of the Ukraine War. In this video essay, I want to focus on what is in my view the best recent interpretation of the war in Ukraine. Emmanuel Todd's La défaite de l'Occident appeared in éditions Galimard 2024, which, though it has just appeared in Spanish, has not found an English publisher. And it may, given the title and given the officially ordained optimism that Ukraine will eventually triumph in Britain and in the USA, likely be too hot a topic for any publisher to handle right now. Since this book is a summary of Todd's views on the state of the world, which are highly original and highly controversial, I will here not attempt to review the whole book, but will rather comment on the initial section, where Todd lists what he calls the 10 surprises of the Ukraine war. I will add 3 more, which have to do with the war itself, rather than with its economic and political context, to which Todd largely confines himself. Clearly, La défaite would not be worth the paper it was written on if the Ukrainian tanks would still roll into Red Square. But the prospects for this appear more remote than ever. Unless the USA will still intervene, that is. And need I remind listeners that Trump said to Zelensky, "You want to involve us in a third world war, and I'm not willing to." Or unless the USA or NATO gives nuclear weapons to Ukraine, something which is in the present situation not impossible and not unimaginable, particularly if Russia would besiege Kiev, which the Ukrainians expect to become the final battle of this war, and or if Russia retaliates on attacks on, say, the Kremlin with US-made long-range missiles, with, say, a nuclear attack on the NATO headquarters in Mainz or on Brussels. In such cases, all the bets are off. And Zelensky is also constantly trying to provoke this, and is calling for it just as Trump pointed out to him. However, for the time being, Ukraine might have had a chance of winning in 2023, a chance it then wasted by clinging to NATO doctrines and NATO tactics. The correlation of forces now is however such that Ukraine, and with it the West, will inevitably be defeated. All that now remains is to further prolong the Ukrainian agony, the destruction and the dying, till Ukraine is in complete ruins and half its population disabled. Though this will surely make some in Ukraine, and many in the US and some in Europe richer. And the people who have become rich in Ukraine will, after the defeat, surely fly to the retreats they have meanwhile bought for themselves in the Bahamas, in Dubai, in Cyprus or Tuscany. They will leave a ruined country behind, with Europe ultimately, I'm afraid, having to pick up the bill for rebuilding that husk of a country. Emmanuel Todd, demographer, anthropologist and historian, is one of the great media personalities of France, much like Timothy Snyder or Neil Ferguson are in the USA. And I venture to say that the comparison does not plead in favor of the USA. But stateside he is not well known. There is one lecture of him given in Princeton available on YouTube. Todd is famous for his first book, La chute finale, from 1976, in which he predicted the coming fall of the Soviet Union. This book came at a time commentators were generally convinced America was in stark decline and the USSR was going from strength to strength. As good as the only other author who then also predicted the fall of the USSR was dissident Andrei Amalrik in his Will the Soviet Union Reach 1988? But to him the fall of the USSR would be caused by a war with China, and while the date in his title was almost correct, Amalrik's supposed cause of the downfall was clearly wide off the mark, whereas Todd foresaw the system collapsing from within, just as eventually happened. The complete failure of all political scientists, besides Todd, to foresee this collapse of the USSR is as monumental a failure as that of the economists who were completely surprised by the 2008 banking crisis. But this has not led to any soul-seeking in either case, or to any serious questioning of the methods they used to have caused two such monumental failures of insight. Instead, everybody was happy to carry on just like before afterwards. And this monumental failure of insight was soon forgotten by both political scientists and economists. Todd, in sum, has any credentials to be taken seriously then, and he has since published several more major studies, such as the highly controversial Qui est Charlie on the deeper causes of the demonstrations and manifestations after the terrorist attack on the cartoon journal Charlie Hebdo in 2015. It seems now almost ancient history, as I come to think of it now. And the other one is La lutte des classes en France au XXe siècle on the 2017 Gilets jaunes movement. The Yellow Vest movement, too, seems to have been as much forgotten as the attack on Charlie Hebdo outside of France. But to understand the results of last year's June election in France, with its admittedly precarious left majority vote, you have to call back to the Gilets jaunes movement. These books are all worth attention and are all worth going into later. Here, however, I want to focus on what is in my view the best recent interpretation of the war in Ukraine, La défaite de l'Occident, which, though it has just appeared in Spanish, has not found an English publisher. Now, since this book is a summary of Todd's views, I will here limit myself to the initial section, where Todd lists what he calls the 10 surprises of the Ukraine war. I will add 3 more, which have to do with the warfare itself rather than with its economic and political context. Let me list Todd's 10 surprises then. First surprise, war in Europe. And the war between states, rather than the civil war which the Yugoslavian conflict, despite the NATO intervention, still was in essence, or as the Chechen war in Russia was. We've had admittedly a small war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the meantime, but most observers would not see the Caucasus as located in Europe, although militarily it was a small, early enactment of the Ukraine war. The present war, in any case, makes nonsense of the EU's foreign policy chief Joseph Borrell oft-repeated image of Europe as the garden, whereas the rest of the world is the jungle. Quite the opposite. The length and ferocity and the sheer staggering numbers of casualties of the conflict have shocked the rest of the world, and they have destroyed henceforth for a long time the idea of Europe as a peaceful continent. For peace you better go to Latin America, where the last interstate war is now 90 years ago, or go to Australasia, which has only ever been involved in any war on the opposite side of the world. And this is also a serious blow to Europe's previous favorite role as moral arbiter of the world. How can it lecture Africa on how to order its society, if it is involved in this mess, for which it at least bears some responsibility? Second surprise, a confrontation between the USA and Russia. To recall, before this war, the US analysts were not predicting and the US military was not preparing for a war with Russia as rather for one with China. Indeed, the community of international relations experts were then commonly talking about the so-called Thucydides trap, by which the resentment of the old hegemon for a rising new one would automatically and inevitably trigger a war between the established power and the challenger. A war with China was hence supposed to be unavoidable. To prepare for such a war, it should have been the prime interest, nay, it ought to have been the US security interest number one, to alienate the Russians from the Chinese. Instead, they found themselves at war via the Ukrainian proxy with the precise wrong party, with Russia. Some hawks in the US Congress now try to rationalize all this by arguing that before taking on China, the US should first try to exhaust its main ally, Russia. But all the indicators are now that the war exhausts the USA as much as it exhausts Russia. So far, the US has admittedly managed to finance the huge costs of the war by basically printing more money. But how long is that confidence trick going to last? And US stocks of weapons are now severely depleted, and it will take years to rebuild. And it will take the US years to take on China therefore too. That the intention of the war was to exhaust Russia seems at any rate to me to be a rationalization after the events. The expectation of the US government in 2021 and in early 2022, when Russia was concentrating troops on the Ukrainian border, was rather that on some threats the Russian government would be forced to withdraw its resistance to the expansion of NATO, and that it could be coerced into accepting a NATO membership for Ukraine, as the Russians had so far always acted. To the State Department, Russia's threats that NATO membership was the brightest of red lines for them, the real invasion came as much as a surprise to everybody as the fall of the USSR had been before. My favorite one still being that of the representative of the United Nations, who reacted 2 weeks into the conflict that war was a 20th century. Let me add to all this that the war was at first not popular in Russia, because the population resented going to war with a brother people. But last year August's supposed strategic masterstroke of invading Russia, concocted by either the Ukrainian High Command or, far more likely, thought up by that of NATO, reinforced the idea among the Russian population that NATO is indeed a direct threat and that the present government of Ukraine is a menace to every Russian. So too did the drone strikes on Russia's strategic nuclear bomber force 3 months ago, an act which can only be interpreted by the Russian government, the Russian army and the Russian population as an attempt to whittle down Russia's capacity to strike back after a NATO nuclear first strike. This makes it all the more important for Russia not to permit any and all US troops in Ukraine, and Russia will never ever permit any deployment of US nukes in Ukraine, since in that case nuclear warning times will be down to minutes, and Russia must launch an all-out nuclear strike at the slightest indication there are American missiles heading their way. This very clearly is not merely an existential threat to Russia, but that Russia has to immediately launch an all-out attack on any perceived threat is a menace to all of humanity. And that makes the stubborn determination of the USA and NATO to make Ukraine a NATO member, including stationing nuclear missiles there, even more incomprehensible. Third surprise: the strong resistance of Ukraine. Before the war, Ukraine was generally seen as a failed state, little better than Somalia or Mauritania. It was a corrupt basket case economy with ailing Soviet-era industries that was completely run by a mere 5 oligarchs and by a bunch of thieving politicians. It was a country whose export was renting Ukrainian wombs for the eggs of infertile German women. I don't imagine this. It was indeed a major industry in Ukraine, or it was an economy which subsisted on remittances of prostitutes in Pattaya or in Amsterdam, and the red light district there was swarming with Ukrainians. Average yearly salary in Ukraine was $3,000 a year, and most people earned far less than that, while the Ukrainian gross national product had been in free fall since 2014. In fact, from a middle-sized economy comparable to that of Spain and the most industrialized part of the USSR, with a higher average income than Russia, Ukraine has now dropped to Europe's poorest country. Everybody, not just in Russia but in the West as well, expected this shaky contraption of a country to collapse quickly, and the Russians expected the Russian-speaking population in places like Kharkiv to all rally to them. Given the deep poverty this shaky conglomerate of a country called Ukraine had crashed its population into. I have been told the Russian forces drove to Kharkiv in school buses carrying flowers, confident on being received by cheering masses. Instead, however, the Ukrainian state has now survived absolutely staggering casualty figures. Anything from 300,000 to 700,000 on a population which is perhaps 23 million inhabitants now, while the US still considers its loss of 63,000 on 200 million people in Vietnam a national trauma. Whether, besides the 5 million refugees, the remaining population of Ukraine feels their resistance to the Russians warrants Ukraine's further existence as a state, and that Ukraine has found its national destiny and its national unity in this war, as Todd argues, plausibly, or whether this war simply feeds on itself is a moot question. The Kiev government and many Western analysts certainly argue that Ukraine has become a nation because of the war. But as all dissident voices are not allowed in Ukraine, and it has a whole army of trolls watching the internet and the social media as well, we simply do not know what Ukraine's population thinks. As to the war feeding on itself, there are plenty cases of soldiers sacrificing themselves for forlorn or hopeless causes, where precisely that the cause is lost is seen as the ultimate proof of heroic sacrifice. The listener remember that the soldiers of the Third Reich not only fought unto the last bullet unto May 1945, that is to defend Hitler when the war was long lost, but the Wehrmacht even suffered its heaviest losses when the war was already long decided. And so too, the poor whites of the US South fought on to the last bullet, even when their cause was long lost, and all that to defend plantation owners who shirked conscription and to defend in the final instance doomed cause of slavery, a cause which had been of no profit to them whatsoever. And yet the heroism of the South is now still greatly admired, precisely since the cause they fought for was completely futile. Whatever the case may be, this quite unexpected Ukrainian resilience and stubborn resistance fueled in turn the equally erroneous idea in the Western mainstream media that Ukraine would eventually triumph in the war after it took back territory in Kharkiv and Kherson in 2022. This overlooked that Russia initially sent in less than 200,000 professional soldiers, whereas Ukraine mobilized 800,000 men, and that Ukraine is 603,700 square kilometers. When the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968 and sent in 500,000 men for a country of 127,900 kilometers. Ukraine now has 835,000 soldiers left, but only half of them are combat ready. The rest is used in border patrols, patrolling the interior and so on. And it has now perhaps 125,000 combat-ready troops available, so that it has now to shuttle its troops around from one theatre to the other, from Sumy to Pokrovsk to Zaporozhye and so on. It is militarily slowly being whittled down, but it is still fighting extremely bravely, as the Russians recognize themselves too. Fourth surprise: the economic resilience of Russia. This was, or ought to be, the biggest surprise of them all. Remember that before the war, Russia was considered a mere gas station, with a country attached to it, and that it was supposedly economically no bigger than Spain. And its gross-national products, and its so-called objective economic indicators, it was only slightly larger than the economy of the Netherlands or of Belgium. The general view, including of virtually all observers from the left in the West, was that Russia was so economically weak that if the West only imposed economic sanctions on it, the country would collapse, and that if only Ukraine held out for a while, Russia would spiral into chaos due to those economic sanctions. For it was supposed Russia was so completely dependent on the West buying its gas and oil that it entirely subsisted on that, and that it had no production to speak of. Most commentators in the so-called reputable media, and on Medium and on YouTube as well, have still pinned all their hopes on this supposed scenario of the coming collapse of the Russian economy. That should then supposedly be followed by a coup in Moscow and by the installation of a kind of Yeltsin II government. But if the Russian economy is now somewhat slowing down, the solid economic growth and the full employment in Russia over the last 3 years seem to give no indication of any economic collapse anytime soon, as even the World Bank has now to admit. Let alone that there are any signs of those bread riots the commentators are still waiting on. But why should people revolt against the government if the country is thriving? Now this is the biggest surprise of all, because the Western commentators were completely fixated on their supposed gross domestic product in dollars, by which Russia was worth 1.8 trillion, the US 23 trillion, and the European Union 30 trillion. By any supposed objective indicator, those two giants should have squashed Russia like a beetle. There is clearly something seriously wrong with that sacrosanct gross national product, an indicator which values, say, Netflix many times higher than it does Russia's energy giant Gazprom. But that maybe the gross-national product is an unreliable measure would take a lot of hard thinking, and Todd is one of the few people who dare to question the sacred gross-national product when he writes that much of the supposed economic science is clearly garbage. In fact, while the West was fixated on its supposed unassailable supremacy in the financial sphere, and thought that closing the SWIFT system of interbank transfers to Russia alone would bring Russia rapidly to its knees, the Russians had from 2014 on quietly prepared for sanctions, and they had financially long become independent of the West, while the sanctions on oil finally hit Europe rather than Russia, as Russia had plenty other countries to sell its oil to. Fifth surprise: the complete disappearance of any European common will. Since the banking crisis of 2007-2008, which made all Southern Europe countries seemingly irrelevant, Europe was supposed to be run by a German-French combine. A combine which since then, as Todd put it, often seemed to be and had functioned like a gunpoint wedding, but nevertheless appeared to have achieved a modicum of autonomy of Europe from the United States. The classic case of this autonomy was the French-German resistance to the American invasion of Iraq, in which Germany's Schröder and France's Chirac were then joined by Putin. It was because of this supposed impartiality of Europe that Putin had hoped to arrange the conflict in Donbass in 2015 with the Minsk Accords, through what he proposed to be impartial mediation of Merkel and Sarkozy, of Germany and France. But instead of taking an independent stance, the European Union in 2022 immediately fell wholeheartedly behind Ukraine and behind the US course on Ukraine. If anything, it was only trying to surpass the USA in its hardline stance. Whether this was from an initial emotional reaction on what was conceived an unprovoked Russian aggression, one from which the European politicians then could not withdraw, as this would have imperiled their position in Parliament, as is typical for the weak leaders they really all are, excepting Hungary's Viktor Orban and to an extent Italy's Giorgia Meloni, or whether it was due to that the US had a stranglehold on the European elite's finances, which they have safely stashed away in tax havens, as Todd argued. I shall not discuss here any further, besides noting that European elites are almost universally trained at US or British universities may have something to do with it as well. What is clear by now is, however, that Germany's prosperity from 2000 on was based on cheap energy from Russia and the vast Chinese market for its products, coupled to a currency, the euro, that was grossly undervalued relative to Germany's productivity. With the sanctions, Germany has now lost the first advantage forever, unless Ukraine would somehow still manage to win the war, as Russia will not make any new deals with such an unreliable partner. And it is likely to lose the Chinese market too, if it continues to follow the US course, which is now heading for a further economic and even military showdown with China. Germany has become virtually irrelevant. Meanwhile, France's diplomatic influence, which it supposed it had before the war, when Macron was clearly constantly fishing for the position of Secretary General of the United Nations, and was always speaking on behalf not merely of Europe but of the civilized world, has, as Todd puts it, evaporated as well. The only way Macron could still think of to draw attention to himself are some musings on and some small initiatives to put French boots on the ground in Ukraine. Instead of the old Paris-Berlin axis of Europe, we now seem to have a new London-Warsaw-Kiev axis that is piloted by Washington. And European countries, let alone the European Union, have diplomatically simply become irrelevant. As witnessed by that the Russians do not even want to talk to Berlin or Paris anymore, let alone to Brussels, which is simply NATO Mark I and NATO Mark II to them. We have in fact strayed far from the ideals of 2000, as the euro was supposed to give Europe far-reaching autonomy vis-à-vis the American dollar, and the nomination of a foreign policy chief for the European Union was to make Brussels to a third independent major player on the world scene next to Washington and Beijing. Objectively, Europe could clearly still be a major player, but European elites appear to have lost any will to achieve this and now blindly follow the USA instead. Sixth surprise: the bellicosity of the United Kingdom. This was obvious from the very beginning. Not only did the British government, whether Tory or Labour, throw itself wholeheartedly behind anything Washington decided, but it tried constantly to trump Washington by being more hardline than the Americans. Most basically, the war could have been over in April 2022. Had the UK's Boris Johnson not intervened and promised Zelensky he could count on support of the US and of the UK for as long as Ukraine needs and for as much as it needs. Something which Zelensky also constantly reminds them of, as this makes him the arbiter on how much he needs. This is surprising, since Brexit was exactly intended to give Britain strategic and economic autonomy vis-à-vis Europe, which was worth any possible economic pain. And this was exactly what the ones who voted for Brexit intended to achieve with it. They wanted to restore British national autonomy. Instead, Britain has now only exchanged its dependence on Europe with a dependence on the USA. And the only autonomy London now has left is that it tries to be more hawkish than Washington. Seventh surprise: the sudden bellicosity of the Scandinavians. And this really applies to all Scandinavians. The F-16 fighter jets the Ukrainians received come from the Danish and are from the Dutch Air Force. Norway, if the well-reputed Seymour Hersh is to be believed at least, helped the USA in its attack on the Nord Stream pipeline. And in any case, even if that attack was organized by Ukraine instead, as Germany now adduces, for which it says it has solid evidence, it still took place in Norwegian territorial waters, and it is extremely unlikely the Norse would not have noticed any preparations for such an attack. And Sweden and Finland both immediately volunteered, or rather the governments did so, because it is not as popular among the population, to become NATO members. For Finland, certainly, this is an extremely risky decision. Its border is only 120 kilometers from Russia's second city and the headquarters of the fleet, St. Petersburg, and the huge Kronstadt naval base is practically off the coast. This is a direct threat to Russia, and if the war in Ukraine is won, it may well turn on Finland. And the only thing Finland then has to withstand the Russians are paper commitments of NATO it will intervene. But Finland is simply too far away from the USA and too close to Russia to intervene with conventional forces and have any chance of winning. But will the USA really risk using nukes to save Finland? For that is the only way to defend it. Will it, in other words, risk the obliteration of Kansas City or of Denver for Helsinki? Sweden has since at least 1813 stayed neutral, and it has prospered with its neutrality during all European wars, coupled with a relatively powerful military, to be sure. And Finland was neutral since 1945, and it has prospered with it too, while Russia was eager to preserve that neutrality as well. What it at least wanted to achieve was that the invasion would be no more than a brief demonstration to the Ukrainians, and that Ukraine was then to have the same status of neutrality as Finland has enjoyed since 1945. And Finland has clearly not been the worse for it. In most respects, it was the world's safest and the world's most pleasant country when it was still a neutral. So would Ukraine likely have been, as it would have become rich with being the great entrepot between Chinese goods, Russian energy and European know-how added to its rich agricultural resources. But Ukraine has apparently chosen to become a ruin, inhabited by disabled people, and Finland has exchanged neutrality for an uncertain status as a vassal of the USA. A status which is certain to ruin Finland economically, as it is utterly dependent on Russian oil and gas. Eighth surprise: the deficiency of the US military-industrial complex. Here was another set of such sacrosanct hard statistics. The US spends half, and in reality even more, of its budget on the military. More than the next 7 countries combined, 6 times more than Russia, and nearly equal to the gross-national product of the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. With this supposed crushing superiority in military spending, the superior US weapons production ought to have completely dwarfed that of Russia. It should simply have been overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of the USA. While with its tiny budget of 120 billion versus the USA's present 1.3 trillion, Russia ought to have been perpetually short of everything. Since Russia was, for example, by March 2022 supposedly already out of microchips, it was now forcing the inhabitants to yield their washing machines to Putin, as Ursula von der Leyen was saying in April 2022. Queen von der Leyen, as I call her. I can similarly still recall the foreign affairs commentator of France 24 station triumphantly pontificating in April of that same year 2022 that Russia would completely run out of missiles within 6 weeks and that it had just 2 months left for all its other weapons. That man is still in that same position, but Russia launches one big rocket attack on the Ukraine after the other, and now virtually every day. Instead of Russia, Ukraine is now desperately short of weapons, most acutely of air defenses, which it simply hasn't got anymore, and of artillery shells, where the Ukrainians have to make any round fired count. And Russia is now outproducing the combined West in virtually all weapon systems. Anything from artillery shells to tanks, over armored personnel carriers to missiles. Now back in World War I, when Britain produced insufficient artillery shells despite the vast amounts of money the government had given to the private manufacturers to make them, this caused a scandal and it forced the government to start producing shells itself. Now, however, the collective West appears to have resigned itself to just throw indefinite amounts of money at arms manufacturers in the hope they will eventually produce sufficient weapons. For if the USA gives a $65 billion aid package to Ukraine, then $40 billion lands up with just 4 firms in the USA. This indicates, on the one hand, that whole vaunted military-industrial complex is just an engine for private enrichment, and that on the other, since Western governments allow this to continue and do not start manufacturing weapons themselves, the Ukraine war is on the brink of it not really that vitally important to them, whereas the outcome of World War I clearly was. Ninth surprise. The West stands alone, and it refuses to face it. The West has become used to enunciating moral values to which the rest of the world has then to conform, so that they supposed, stupidly, that the rest of the world would share their indignation at Russia's actions. They were wrong, thus thought. Looking at the map of the vote in the United Nations in favor of a blockade of Russia, the countries to vote yes were the Western countries, the expected 3 added ones, Japan, South Korea and Israel, plus a smattering of minuscule US allies, such as the inevitable Tuvalu. Everybody else voted no or abstained. And the little initial support the West still had when indignation at the Russian invasion was still fresh has been further eroded since. That China would not support the West could have been predicted, yet it was still inexplicably a cause of moral outrage and even caused the US to issue threats to China that if it dared to support Russia, this would have dire consequences, as if China could be threatened in that way. Much more embarrassing is that there was also no enthusiasm and no support from India, which makes it impossible and absurd to make the anti-Russia bloc into a league of free people opposed to authoritarianism. Since the world's largest democracy clearly does not participate in that league, and let us not forget, neither does Brazil and neither does another important democracy, South Africa. It is simply an affront to that last country, which has fought so hard for truly participatory democracy, to say it is favoring authoritarian rule when it is supporting Russia. All of this notwithstanding, European and US politicians still praise themselves as the champions of liberty. Again, Iran and Russia are habitually now carelessly jumbled together, but historically Iran has had 3 main enemies, namely the UK, the USA and Russia, while it always had close relations with European countries, with France and with Germany in particular. These two and the European Union have now utterly spoiled their relations with Iran with their out-and-out support of the USA and of Israel. Worst of all for the Union, Turkey is moving further and further away from the West and is likely to become a member of the BRICS bloc instead. This means that the European Union membership, for which the US has been pressing the European Union for decades, is now off the agenda. Meanwhile, as the global south suffers from the blockade with high oil and gas prices next to soaring prices of grain, the effects of the West's relentless hammering on its blockade have eroded the initial support to and sympathy with the Ukraine when it was first faced with Russian aggression and when most global South countries condemned the Russian action. To which I must add that the arrogant behaviour of Ukraine towards the global South has not much contributed to sympathy with its cause. Typical cases were Zelensky not showing up in a pre-arranged meeting with Brazil's President Lula Inácio da Silva, or the maltreatment of a South Africa-led African peace delegation, or again Ukraine's gloating on how Ukraine helped jihadists, had killed a Wagner mercenary and troops from Mali. What is the use of Ukraine opening more embassies in Africa now, the bill for which is to be paid by the European and US taxpayer, of course, to counter Russia on that continent, if it then behaves like that? Above all, though, the constant condemnation of Russian imperialism by such countries as England, France or the USA irks the entire South, which has never experienced Russian imperialism, but sure enough has felt the imperialism of those three countries. Let me skip tot surprise 10 for the moment and add 3 more that are not mentioned by Todd, but are just as surprising. Surprise 10. The mediocre performance of the Western supposed wonder weapons. Before the war, the standard argument of the military-industrial complex in the USA and of its smaller sisters in Britain, France and Germany was that their weapons might be extremely expensive, but that this high price was well warranted by the superior quality. These weapons were supposedly vastly more advanced than any Russian ones, which were supposedly 2 decades behind Western technology. Of course, given the overall vast technological lead of the West over Russia, which was supposedly, after all, nothing but Bangladesh with nuclear weapons, as German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt used to call it. Russian weapons were therefore crude and unsophisticated, and Russia would be utterly outgunned by the sophisticated weapons of the West. This conviction underlaid the frontal attack of Ukraine on the Russian positions of 2023, when the Ukraine's NATO advisors assumed Russian forces would all run once they were faced with the invincible Western weaponry, the armor of which they would not even be able to scratch. The result clearly was the precise opposite of what they had imagined. Hordes of those support Western miracle weapons, aflame, or even more shamefully for the manufacturers, abandoned by their crews as just as many driving coffins on the steppes. All these miraculous Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, all that supposed acme of Western tank design, the Leopard 2. All these Marder infantry fighting vehicles, and so on and on. All aflame or wrecks towed away by the Russians. And the Russian infantry could indeed mock the West. Please send us more of your miracle weapons, so that we can cashier a higher premium if we then immediately destroy them. Most humiliating of all to Western manufacturers was that for the circumstances of the Ukraine, not the supposed whiz-bang Western equipment proved the most efficient, but rather the old 70s and 80s Warsaw Pact equipment the Ukrainian army was using before. Not just because Western weapons were far too complicated and needed years of training to use them effectively, but also because they suffered from all kinds of constant mechanical glitches and could not be rapidly repaired in the field. And worse is that this Western equipment guzzles fuel at a prodigious rate. This fuel has then to be supplied by tanker trucks over bad or congested roads. This brought the Ukrainian attempt to advance to the city of Kursk to a standstill, for example. It came as a complete surprise to the Russians, and there was at first no resistance at all. But the fuel-guzzling Western tanks had to be supplied by those tanker trucks, and those fuel trucks, which were stretched out over one single-lane road, could then easily be picked off by Russian teams just armed with a rocket-propelled grenade, or by drones and aircraft. All that Ukrainian sophisticated Western equipment soon enough ran out of fuel far from any of their fuel depots, and most of it had to be abandoned. Since such whiz-bang equipment is merely a death trap to the crews if it is out of fuel without any protection against bombers or helicopters. What is apparent in all this is that Western equipment is more made to look nice and to score impressive results on the firing range than for actual use in battle. Of course, since it is largely made to impress buyers with all its so-called sophisticated gadgetry, which causes the constant mechanical breakdowns it suffers, rather than for any real use. Thus, not only does the military-industrial complex vastly overcharges the taxpayer, But what it makes is not even very good, or more precisely, it is not very effective in real battlefield conditions, rather than that it only does well during maneuvers in optimal conditions. However, the military-industrial complex appears not to have learned anything from the Ukraine war and continues to turn out the same maintenance-intensive flashbang equipment that cannot be repaired on the battlefield and that still guzzles fuel at a prodigious rate. The war also taught that the tank is an obsolete weapon unless it has some immediate point defenses against drones, which it presently has not. But there has been no modification to NATO tank designs whatsoever, and the governments are now ordering hundreds of these tanks more. Surprise 11. The slow progress of the war. This was a surprise to everybody, the Russians as much as the West. Before the war, all militaries subscribed to some variety of the cherished World War II model of the blitzkrieg or of the deep penetration, as the Soviets and the Russians called it. The idea was that massive columns led by armor and followed by infantry fighting vehicles would punch through the enemy lines and then fan out in the rear to surround and then to roll up the remaining enemy pockets of resistance. This model appeared to be warranted by all modern wars, the 1967 Israel-Arab War, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and above all by the first Gulf War for the Americans. And all armies were confident this would remain the pattern of armed conflict right into the 21st century. Both the initial Russian advance into Ukraine and the Ukrainian offensive, in which the Ukrainian military was coaxed by its NATO advisors, reluctantly, as they knew it would not be effective, followed this blitzkrieg model. But it has been made obsolete by satellite surveillance and by drones. Large groupings of forces and very conspicuous groupings of mechanized forces in particular are now immediately seen by the enemy, and it can then rain down artillery fire on them. And modern artillery can sow minefields in an instant. And forces that are bunched together are ideal targets for drone swarms as well. Any concentration of forces, therefore, just means many easy-to-kill targets. The troops now have to spread out and to stay within the range of artillery and, above all, within the range of anti-air defenses, as much against drones as against aircraft, missiles and helicopters on the Ukrainian side, that is. The consequence of this is that the pace of the military operations in the Ukraine is very slow. It is not like blitzkrieg at all, but is rather like the slow, cautious advance of the Allied armies in 1918, when infantry had to similarly spread out and stay within range of the artillery, so that it too could advance only a few hundred meters a day. Both parties meanwhile understand this after their hard experience, but it continues to elude all the supposed Western military experts who continue to deride Russia's slow, cautious advance in small groups, and rather claim all this is due to Ukraine's continuous victories, which supposedly have made the Russians frightened. Surprise 12. Technology proved highly overrated. This was a surprise to everybody as well. Everybody, including again the Russians, thought that in an age in which technologically savvy small bands of troops, those special forces that are so dear to Hollywood, could easily overcome badly trained mass armies, the days of those massed armies had passed, and that military operations would henceforth be conducted by small bands of highly trained and highly skilled specialist professional forces. The Ukraine war proved everybody wrong. Both sides needed ever more troops, and where the Russians started the war with a small professional army, they have been continuously enlisting more troops nowadays, and the army has grown from 300,000 to 1.2 million men. Far from the mass armies being made obsolete by technological advances, the core of the army is clearly still the good old infantry squad, and technology is only of some and then only of limited help. The great technological breakthrough of this war are clearly the drones, which, as said, are the main cause for its slow advance. But then this is a technology, the radio-guided aircraft, which was already around in the 70s, and the clear other war-winning weapon, the glide bomb, is simply upgraded ancient Soviet technology. In contrast, all the supposed whiz-bang technology, which was to give the Ukraine a decisive advantage, has proven to be of little or limited use, or it was immediately easily parried by the Russians. For example, the much touted US smart munitions, to which the Russians had developed electronic countermeasures in no time, or the fabled Patriot air defense system, which could not deal with hypersonic missiles and was easily overcome by swarms of drones. Let me finally return to Todd. 12th surprise, the defeat of the West. As Todd notes, political scientist John Mearsheimer warned for this from the very beginning. Russia would and will eventually prevail in this war, as the stationing of a NATO army on its border is an existential threat to Russia. And if some Russians still had doubts about this, that there are US soldiers in Ukrainian uniform now being killed within Russia suffices to convince even the last remaining skeptics there that Russia is indeed threatened by the USA. It is therefore prepared to throw its every last reserve at it, even if the population would suffer, which it additionally presently does not. For the US, on the other hand, the conflict is not a life or death issue. It will eventually withdraw if Ukraine is losing, and the disparity between the manpower and the industrial capacity of the Ukraine and Russia is such that Russia will inevitably eventually prevail. However, argues Todd, the real problem with the Ukraine war is in a way not Russia, which is a classic sovereign state, defending what it sees as its proper sovereignty against encroachment on its territory by a rival great power. This is something states have been doing since the 16th century, going back to Valois, France, and its encirclement by the Habsburgs in the days of Emperor Charles V. Russia is just acting as France in that time. The problem is rather with the USA, for which those sovereign states do not exist anymore, or for whom rather sovereign states have no right to exist anymore due to the relentless advance of globalization, which is led by the USA. And the problem is with the USA, the United Kingdom, and with the European countries which have surrendered their national sovereignty to the European Union. They are no longer nation states, but are now rather part of a post-imperial empire, as Todd calls it. This empire has killed its middle classes, or is in the process of doing so. It has killed, or is in the process of doing so, its industrial working class, and it is destroying its industrial base to benefit a rootless post-national elite dependent on international finances and one having contempt for its own population. An elite too which sees military force increasingly as a solution to any problem and that will resort to it when it encounters the slightest form of resistance to its global ambitions. This is to Todd what really is at stake in the Ukraine war. It is in turn indicative of a deeper crisis, and that is the abandonment by this elite of some basic old Western values, such as the Protestant virtue of savings and of the nuclear family for hedonistic mass consumption and gender-neutral individualism. It is in sum the confrontation of a post-Christian, post-value elite on the one side, the US and the European Union, and the traditional national state and popular community on the other. Russia. Thus Todd concludes, at the end, one simple truth stands out. The crisis of the Occident is the motor of this phase of history that we are living through. Many are already aware of this. When this war is over, nobody will be able to deny it.